It's 3:30 in the afternoon on the 22nd of November 1917. Gathering around the Dakhla oasis in the middle of the Egyptian desert, tribesmen suddenly look up. Looming out of the sky is a gigantic object that drifts above them with an unsettling drone. To the inhabitants it appears to be a visitation from God, but in reality it's just a lone German airship on a unique relief mission. While its journey through Africa would be remembered for generations by the God-fearing locals, this astonishing wartime feat has been largely forgotten to history. So let's explore the reasons behind and the failure of Germany's attempt to resupply its fledgling guerrilla army in German East Africa, which they did by sending in an airship, popularly called Zeppelins, on the longest military endurance flight then attempted. The story goes back to the very earliest days of the Great War. Germany as a colonial power needed to defend its possessions from the Allies, just as much as they did from her. This included German East Africa, which is roughly the area around Tanzania today. By 1916, the small Schutztruppe force of some 14,000 men, led by General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, had been fighting the Allies for nearly 2 years. His commander, a mixture of 3,000 European officers and men, bolstered by 11,000 Askari or locally recruited Africans, had been a great morale booster for the German people. However, von Lettow-Vorbeck was slowly becoming overwhelmed by the enemy, from whom his troops liberated much of their supplies and ammunition. Something had to be done. Now, we might see the struggle in German East Africa and the rest of the continent as something of a sideshow to the battles being fought on the western and eastern fronts. In reality, keeping a fighting force in at least one of the colonial possessions was an important German negotiation tool for the expected peace talks that would end the war. Resupplying VLV was a priority, but very difficult given the Allied blockade. The audacious notion to resupply its Schutztruppe by airship came, it is reported, not from German high command, but rather from a German zoologist. Professor Dr. Max Zupitzer was both a zoologist and a medical doctor, who had spent many years living and working in German Southwest Africa. He was captured when the Allies took Windhoek, the capital of modern Namibia, in August 1914 and spent nearly 2 years in a prisoner of war camp before returning to Germany. While incarcerated, Zupitzer had heard about VLV's remarkable fight in German East Africa against a force more than 200 times his number. On his return, he realised the importance of finding a way to support those forces in the field. In July 1917, Zupitzer read about the amazing 101-hour endurance flight of the Army-operated R-class Zeppelin LZ-120. Under the command of Ernst Lehrmann, the airship had completed the amazing feat before landing in the face of an expected storm, with another 14 hours worth of fuel in its tanks. For Zupitzer, this was the answer. He petitioned the Colonial Office with the idea to resupply its fighting men in German East Africa with one of its most terrifying weapons, the Zeppelin. This petition was also not to be his last association with the scheme, and we'll hear more from him later in the story. Apparently, the Reichskolonialamt was open to odd suggestions, and the idea was later submitted to the Imperial German Naval Airship Division for consideration. The scheme was not immediately dismissed, though several obstacles were quickly identified. Firstly, the closest base to German East Africa was Yamboli or Yambol today in Bulgaria, and was still 3,600 miles from VLV and his men. Another issue was that at the time, no airship could carry the useful load necessary to supply the troops and get to the area. This was not something that would prohibit an attempt, but an airship would need to be built with a larger fuel capacity to make the journey and to be able to carry cargo that distance. Another and more important consideration was the fact that there were no air bases in Africa to replenish an airship's hydrogen cells. This meant that any craft that did manage to rendezvous with VLV would not be able to complete a return trip. The Naval Airship Division also pointed out that the African interior was largely uncharted, and this would make navigation across this immense landscape extremely challenging. To add to this, no airship had attempted to fly through such tropical areas before. Any crew undertaking the journey would experience extreme temperature variations, which could compromise the lighter than aircraft, leading to difficult handling conditions. While the Germans didn't have adequate air bases to accommodate an airship, the Allies had aerodromes both in North and East Africa. This meant that in addition to the very real dangers that the weather presented, attack from Allied aircraft was also a very real danger. To put it bluntly, everyone at the Naval Airship Division would have seen such a mission as a very high-risk venture. Nevertheless, Fregattenkapitän Peter Strasser, chief of the Imperial Naval Airship Division, endorsed the mission wholeheartedly and said, "Completion of the operation will not only provide immediate assistance to the brave Protectorate troops, but will be an event which will once more enthuse the German people and rouse admiration throughout the world." Admiral von Hosendorf, chief of the Imperial Naval Staff, and German Kaiser Bill himself were both keen and gave their own support to the mission, which would be codenamed China Matter. This was all well and good, but there still remained two key elements in order to make the hazardous mission even possible, let alone its success: an airship that could make the journey and a commander to get it there. Under normal conditions, the Navy would have sent their most experienced commander and crew, but on this mission, no return journey was expected, and those men would ultimately end up fighting as infantry with a Schutztruppe. Be that as it may, every airship commander that heard about the mission wanted to undertake it, but Strasser knew that he needed to keep his best men free to wreak havoc on Allied targets in Europe. So a less experienced team would need to be sent. The commander selected was known to be a career-hungry opportunist and was not particularly liked by his peers because of this ambition. The man finally chosen was Kapitän-Leutnant Ludwig Bockholt, who had risen to notoriety in April 1917. While in command of L-23, Bockholt had intercepted and captured the Norwegian schooner Royal, which was carrying contraband material to Britain. Though not an enormous impact on the trade war with the Allies, the act boosted morale amongst the men and showed the courage of the selfless careerist Bockholt. With a man chosen, a suitable airship needed to be found. L-57, which in October 1917 was then under construction at Friedrichshafen, was selected for the mission. In order to complete such a voyage, the original airship's design had to be modified. For the 3,600-mile journey, the hull was lengthened by 99 feet to make room for 2 additional gas cells. This would bring the total hydrogen capacity of the craft up to 2,418,000 cubic feet, making L-57 the largest airship ever built to date, and with a much larger cargo carrying potential. This is where perhaps the most ingenious part of the resupply scheme came about. As it was accepted that L-57 would be making a one-way trip, every effort was made to maximise its usefulness to the German war effort in Africa. Several modifications were made to L-57 so that it could be recycled in the field. The radio transmitter and its dynamo were to be converted into a transportable ground radio station. This would be done by using fuel and engines from the ship, with parts of the hull's allied girders to support radio aerials. Due to their light nature, this would enable VLV to remain mobile while also in better contact with Berlin. The superstructure of the airship was also earmarked as a useful source of resources for the Schutztruppe. By removing the cotton fabric which enclosed the hull of the ship and fitting this to deconstructed metal girders, the troops could fashion portable shelters for themselves and their equipment. The airship would become home to many more men than the 22-man crew that flew it to Africa. In addition to shelter, the walkway around the hull was made of leather specifically so it could be reused to make men's boots when it arrived in the field. I find these modifications absolutely ingenious, and they would certainly have made a difference to the men fighting the Allies in the bush. However, L-57 would never make it out of Germany. After completing her maiden flight on the 2nd of September, L-57 still needed to be put through several trial flights to ensure she was ready to undertake the long flight to German East Africa. Disaster struck on her 4th flight around Jüterbog near Berlin during bad weather. While attempting to secure the airship in this bad weather, she was damaged beyond repair and actually fell to earth in flames. Luckily, her crew escaped, including Bockholt, who was at the helm. Reportedly, it was Bockholt himself who had ordered men on the ground to puncture the giant airship with rifle bullets when he struggled to land her in the difficult weather. If this is true, it certainly showed a certain ignorance of the airship's construction and a flagrant disregard for the very real danger of fire this would have represented. Despite the loss of L-57 and Bockholt's own acceptance of responsibility for its demise, he remained commander of the mission. Other men in the Naval Airship Division wanted to replace him and thought he should be removed, but Strasser remained adamant that Bockholt would be the man for the job. Later, Strasser probably realised that sending this fairly inexperienced and reckless commander was better than losing one of his more able skippers who would do more good fighting over London. Another inexperienced man who joined the crew was Zupitzer, the zoologist who suggested the mission. He volunteered to serve as the medical officer on board the airship that would be sent to Africa. He was duly accepted and shared in the fate of the men he had indirectly sent on such a hazardous mission. At the same time, conditions in German East Africa were getting worse. In October, von Lettow-Vorbeck had fought the British in a battle at Mahivwa, where he inflicted over 2,000 casualties on the enemy, but lost just over 500 men himself. While the Allied forces quickly recovered and replenished, there was little prospect of that for the Schutztruppe. At the end of November, VLV led his troops across the Rovuma River into Portuguese Mozambique. Although they were able to resupply by raiding a Portuguese supply station, they were now in a precarious position and far from the intended rendezvous point of the Zeppelin. The Germans had to act quickly. Just 2 days after the loss of L-57, L-59, which was the next airship on the construction bill, was reassigned to the mission. Due to the desperate need to maintain a German presence in East Africa, the airship was built around the clock and completed in just 16 days. L-59 made her maiden flight on the 25th of October and completed all her trials without incident. Again, with haste, she was loaded with 13 3/4 tons of war material and supplies and then flown to Bulgaria on the 4th of November. At this point, Bockholt only had the vaguest of information as to where VLV's troops were. He was told to head to a position somewhere on the present-day Tanzania and Mozambique border and scout out a large group of troops. If and when he found friendly troops, he was to remain aloft outside small arms fire and then find a volunteer petty officer to jump by parachute to confirm that he had indeed found VLV's small army. Despite the man's reputation for bravery and decisiveness, it must have seemed like an almost impossible task. After some false starts, L-59 started its mission on the 21st of November, launching in perfect weather, breezy and with a ground temperature close to zero, which gave L-59 improved lift characteristics as the hydrogen in its fuel cells was warmer than the outside air. Before the flight, each of the gas cells had been filled up to 95% of its capacity to allow room for the hydrogen's expansion, which was expected in the hotter African climate. It took 400 men to drag the airship out of its hangar, and then it was held steady while the engines were started with their 14-foot two-blade propellers stationary and unclutched from the engines. Finally, L-59 was launched at 8:30 AM with Bockholt's order "up ship" and slowly headed south. Now, if you are as unfamiliar with airships as I was, it might be a good point to talk about L-59 and what it actually looked like and how it was able to stay aloft. L-59 was 743 feet long, which is roughly 3 times the length of a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, as well as being 91 feet wide, which is 4 times the average passenger jet's girth. On takeoff, L-59 had a gross weight of 77 1/4 tons, which included the 13 3/4 ton supplies for the Schutztruppe, around 21 tons of petrol and lubricating oil, 9 tons of water ballast, and the 22-man crew with food for 10 days. Incidentally, the food available consisted largely of cans of Coloritcon, which was a bizarre sort of self-heating MRE, or meal ready to eat. Reportedly, these were fairly indigestible, over-salted tubes of potted meat that literally cooked themselves via a chemical reaction when exposed to air. This was necessary because trying to heat food over an open flame or even smoking was strictly forbidden aboard such a flammable airship. In addition to this, the Caloritcon, which were not popular, took a fair bit of water to wash down. On a ship where water was scarce, with barely 14 litres carried per man for the duration of the voyage, this must have been nearly unbearable. The ship itself was powered by 5 6-cylinder Maybach HSLU petrol engines, which each developed 240 horsepower and drove a 2-blade pushing propeller. This combined 1200 horsepower was distributed between 4 gondolas hanging below the airship. The front gondola was known as the control car and accommodated 5 men: the captain, the second in command, the radio operator and 2 ratings, one to operate the rudders and the other to operate the elevators. At the rear of this car was a single engine and propeller. 2 side gondolas also housed one of these engines each at its rear, while the aft gondola housed 2 of these engines which were paired and drove a single propeller. During the flight, each engine would be stopped periodically for maintenance, so in fact only 4 engines at most would be in operation at one time. It's also perhaps useful to talk about the basic theory of flight for an airship here, which will help us understand the obstacles faced by L-59 during its journey. In very brief terms, the crew of a lighter-than-air craft such as L-59 had to balance buoyancy by correctly managing the ballast and adapting to the volume of the hydrogen in its gas cells, which included venting the gas at times. Temperature greatly affected how light the aircraft could be. As the hydrogen's volume expanded or contracted, it would either make the craft more or less buoyant. Being lighter, and indeed heavier than the surrounding ambient air, had its dangers, and a skilled hand was needed to manage an airship like L-59. When L-59 left its base in Yamboli, Bulgaria, it didn't have any advanced meteorological information. This meant that the crew would be at the mercy of the weather it met and couldn't deviate around known storms or areas of unfavourable conditions. Setting off at an average cruising altitude of 20,000 feet with a speed of about 40 miles per hour, all fared well until L-59 reached the south of the Turkish coast. Around 10 PM on that first night, just off the coast of Crete, a sudden fearful shout rang out, "Fire! Fire! We're on fire!" The men's blood must have run cold, as on a hydrogen-laden ship, then at 8,000 feet, it was a death sentence. In fact, there was no fire. Instead, L-59 had met an electrical storm over the sea, and while descending had encountered St. Elmo's fire. What the inexperienced lookout had seen and heard as fire on the whole was actually this strange meteorological phenomenon. No doubt a little shaken, the crew pressed on, flying ever closer to the beleaguered Schutztruppe. On the 22nd, the airship crossed the Egyptian coast near Sollum. As the British had several bases in the Nile Delta, Bockholt kept well west of the area before crossing into the vast desert. Due to the lack of ground features, the crew relied on celestial navigation, particularly sun lines, to plot their course. Bockholt was also able to calculate L-59's drift and ground speed by using a simple stopwatch and observing its shadow's progression from one fixed point to another. Knowing the ship's length to the millimetre allowed for very accurate calculations. However, navigation over a featureless and largely uncharted landscape was simple when compared with the weather the crew of L-59 had to contend with. Conditions over the hot African desert were very different to operating an airship in European skies. During the day, when the sun heated the hull and the hydrogen inside, it led to superheating. This was when the hydrogen reached as much as 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding air. This resulted in the airship becoming much lighter than the air around it, and so it climbed. More than being embarrassing for a crew who should be able to hold the craft at a steady height, it could be perilous for the success of the flight. If this additional lift took the airship above 25,000 feet, it would engage an automatic pressure release valve, which presented excess expansion of the hydrogen. However, if too much of this gas was purged, L-59 might not make it to German East Africa at best, and at worst, could actually plummet to the ground. While L-59 experienced extreme heat during the day, it also underwent very cold temperatures at night. As the volume of the hydrogen decreased, the crew needed more of it to maintain altitude. So, to counteract this effect, Bockholt ordered that L-59 be flown with a nose down position while over the desert. Although prudent, flying in this attitude also held its risks. Because of the airship's size, a few degrees nose up or nose down, with ballast to compensate, produced a lot of drag and reduced the flying speed. A unique characteristic of an airship is that when considerably lighter than air, if they stall, they will drift upwards, not down. This again risks climbing above 25,000 feet and automatically purging more hydrogen. Another phenomenon of flying over the hot desert was the rising air, which caused L-59 to rise and fall gently. This constant buffeting caused air sickness, even for the veteran flyers, and must have just added to the misery of the men. The lookouts also developed bad headaches from looking at the bright reflections of the sand. This was clearly no pleasure cruise, and things were about to get worse. Meanwhile, based on the commander's calculations, L-59 had been sailing across the hot Egyptian desert at 60 miles per hour until 4 in the afternoon that day. Suddenly, a juddering and then stationary propeller in the forward engine slowed progress. Mechanics determined that the issue was a cracked reduction gear, and it wouldn't be repaired until they reached the ground. Although the airship could proceed on its 4 remaining engines, the broken one also powered the dynamo that provided power to the radio transmitter. This was a huge blow to the mission, but Bockholt proceeded nonetheless. Late that night, L-59 passed the Nile at Wadi Halfa, and by midnight the airship was in Sudan and reached about the same latitude as Khartoum. At this point, the crew of L-59 had travelled 2,800 miles and were roughly halfway to their destination. While Bockholt had been struggling against the weather and the heat of the Trans-African voyage, the Colonial Office had received worrying information. Intercepted British radio reports said Allied troops had invaded previously secure areas of German East Africa, and somehow the news that VLV was now far from where the crew thought he was became apparent. This meant that a successful rendezvous was unlikely, and very much to the chagrin of the Kaiser himself, a recall signal was sent out. In fact, just 3.5 hours into the flight, officials at the Kolonialamt had been informed of the Allied advances into the Kondi Highlands. Unfortunately, L-59 had damaged its main antenna during a low-level recovery and wound in its remaining antennas due to electrical storms, and thus was unreachable. The message was repeatedly sent using the most powerful transmitters in Germany, but it wasn't until the crew was in Sudan that the message was picked up. By this point, with inoperable equipment, they could not transmit any acknowledgement of the recall. Back in Berlin, they feared the worst, and L-59 was assumed lost somewhere over Africa. We have to remember that conditions on L-59 were pretty bad. The food was awful, the temperatures at altitude extreme, and the demands on the crew intense. Only the thought of saving their beleaguered comrades in Germany's Africa spurred them on. When Bockholt gave the order to return to Bulgaria, the morale on board dropped. Reportedly, the cases of nervous tension and feverishness among the crew increased dramatically, but disappointment was the least of their worries. On the return journey, while flying towards cooler skies, L-59 experienced another meteorological effect on its hydrogen, which almost ended in disaster. On the night of its return journey to Europe, L-59 experienced supercooling, where the volume of its hydrogen retracted and lessened its lighter-than-air characteristics. To maintain 30,000 feet to clear land obstacles in the area, Bockholt ordered the ship to maintain a 4-degree nose-up attitude. Even with 4 engines running full power and dropping 4,400 pounds of water ballast, the supercooling effect drove the craft down. At 3 AM the next morning, L-59 ran into an area of warm air without the knowledge of the crew, and by maintaining the 4-degree nose-up angle, the helmsman actually stalled the now heavier-than-air ship. In addition, with airflow lost over the control surfaces, the ship began to act like a huge, uncontrollable parachute, which descended at a steady 150 feet per minute. Trying to lighten the load of an airship in this situation further was dangerous, as if you threw out too much ballast, when it recovered from the dive, it could rise up again uncontrollably. Bockholt acted in the right way, releasing some ballast and having the props declutched until he'd recovered control. With no immediate effect, he released more ballast in the form of 6,600 pounds of cargo for VLV, which was no longer needed. Even so, L-59 narrowly missed crashing into a hill, and the airship recovered low over a ravine and surrounded by sharp hillsides. With impressive skill, the crew managed to climb out of the precarious position and made its way northward. L-59 retraced her steps and left the Egyptian coast by the 24th, crossing the Med without incident. While crossing over the mountains of Turkey, the crew almost suffered the same fate as it had over the Upper Nile, being pushed down by a downdraft, but releasing another 3 tons of ballast and undelivered ammunition restored control. The airship arrived back at Yamboli at 4:30 AM on the 25th of November, but with no radio communication, and not being expected as it was already feared lost, L-59 had to circle for a few hours until a landing crew was formed. Finally, the tired crew settled on the ground again at 7:40 AM. What may on the face of it seem like a terrible failure was actually a flight that had lasted 95 hours and 5 minutes over 4 days and represented a distance of 4,200 miles, roughly the distance from London to Miami. For the time, the crew had broken every long-distance record and with a heavier load than ever carried before. What's more, L-59 had 2,760 imperial gallons of fuel left in her tanks, which was enough for an additional 2.5 days of flight. In short, the crew would have easily made it to German East Africa, and with luck have found VLV to fulfill their mission. At the time, Bockholt and his crew did not get the public recognition they rightly deserved. Because of wartime conditions, the voyage was treated as a closely guarded military secret, as other possible long-distance flights were being considered. However, there are several reports that suggest people probably already knew about it, at least that a huge airship had been built and its destination was somewhere in Africa. The Schutztruppe, though feared at the end of its road in late 1917, rallied, and von Lettow-Vorbeck continued to mount sporadic attacks on the Allies until the end of the war. Unfortunately, L-59 was not destined to survive the Great War. The airship set out on a routine bombing mission to Valletta, the capital of Malta, on the 7th of April 1918. En route, the airship burst into flames and crashed into the sea with no survivors, some of which were certainly on board its earlier African adventure. No Allied units claimed the Zeppelin, and a German investigation concluded lost through accidental causes, possibly leaking petrol catching fire or hydrogen ignition. In November 1917, L-59 conducted the longest lasting operational flight pretty much ever, and it is one of the rare examples of a Great War mission to rival those that came 20 years later. If you've made it this far, then please like the video to help it spread to more people, and as you obviously like stories of heroism as much as I do, check out the video I've made for you on screen now.